Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a special treat this afternoon with a 53-year career, 54-year?
I'm afraid so.
53-year career behind him and still going strong. This man is a legend in his field and Britain's longest-serving racehorse trainer. In 2021, 46 of his 50 horses won a race, and in all he's had over 2,000 winners, including Alpinista, which last year won 7 British races in a row, followed by the Arc de Triomphe, the richest prize in all of Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Mark Prescott. So, I mean, what a life you have led.
I've been lucky. I've more luck than I ever thought I'd get.
Do you think?
Yes, I do. I do.
Well, I read somewhere, when you won the Arc de Triomphe, you had... Sir Mark is a very popular guy in his field, which I think is probably quite unusual, I don't know, but he had between 1,300 and 1,500 letters of congratulation when Alpinista won the Arc de Triomphe, and you wrote to every one of them, Mark.
Well, I did. Thank goodness there were 75 that I couldn't read the address on. So I was able to discard those. But what was fascinating was that the best letter I had, all these wonderful people who wrote in, the best one was an email, and it had come 3 minutes after the horse passed the post in the Arc de Triomphe. You could tell on the timing it had come 3 minutes. And it came from a very famous racehorse trainer called Mick Shannon. And Mick Shannon, poor man, had trained 3 runners-up in the Arc de Triomphe and had never won it. And I'd won it with my first runner. And the email just said, "Lucky fucker." And I never had a better one, you know. Of all 1,600, nobody was as good as that. Yeah.
So let's go back to the beginning, because did you have a promising start? I mean, were you good at school? How did school go?
No, I was appalling at school. I went to 4 prep schools.
4?
And the last one was a school called Ludgrove, which was well known. And in the end, by the time I got to Ludgrove, I'd been at every school that we played cricket against, which I think is a unique achievement. And no, I used to go home. I used to get home as quickly as I could. And my greatest achievement was my parents dropped me off at Ludgrove, having got chucked out of the other 3 schools. And they were going to go to the theatre in Exeter on their way home. And they chucked me out of the car at the school. I didn't like the look of it, and I kept walking, and there was a church at the back, and then there was a road, and I kept walking down the road. And I got to the cricketers at Bagshot, and there was a lorry which had Liskeard, Cornwall, on the side. So I jumped up on the wheel and said, "My name's Mark Prescott, and I've run away from school." And he said, "Well done." He said, "Where are you heading?" So I said, "Newton Abbot." So he drove me all the way to Newton Abbot. And by then we got great friends, of course. And he said, "I can't leave you in the town." So he drove this Arctic lorry up onto the edge of Dartmoor, dropped me off, and I was home before my parents. and so I got into the back of the house and tucked myself up in bed. And the old man, I could hear him coming in with mother. They'd been to the theatre, and they were going up the stairs, and I could hear clonk, 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 clonk. And then he saw a chink of light under my bedroom. He said, "The little bugger's back." So he picked me up and drove me straight back. And we arrived at Ludgrove. Mr. Barber was the headmaster. And Mr. Barber came to the door in a dressing gown and slippers, because it was 5 in the morning. The old man had driven all day, you see. And he said, "A fine school you're running here." He said, "You're missing one and you don't even know." Yeah. And I ran away once more after that. And by now he'd got my measure. And I got to the cricketers, and it was dark and it was wet, and there was no lorry with Liskeard on it. And so I ran out of nerve. And I waited till 9 o'clock at night, when the old man would be going round the farm. Rang 9 o'clock. "I'll get mother, she'll be sympathetic." And to my horror, a voice said, "King's Kerswell 2-1. And it was the old man. I said, "Marky here. I've run away from school." He said, "Go back." And it went brrr, and I went back, and they never knew I'd gone. So that was the last time. So he got me right in the end, yeah.
But was it at Ludgrove where the famous cricket match took place, the disastrous cricket?
Yes, every team I was in was the worst team we'd ever had. And we went to play cricket at school, and we lost by an immense number of runs. And we felt that, as they'd rather beaten us up at cricket, it would be a good idea to, as we were changing in a dormitory, we'd make all 20 beds, we'd give them an apple pie bed, and we'd squirt some Colgate toothpaste down. And so we sort of wrecked the place, and then we got on the bus. And unfortunately, telephonic communication meant that the bad news had been relayed to Mr. Barber, not only that we'd lost by the largest margin any team from Ludgrove had ever lost, but we'd also made 20 apple pie beds. And when we arrived back at the school, there was a porch, and Mr. Barber was in the door flexing a cane in what I felt was rather an aggressive manner. And he beat us all in batting order, including, which I felt was very unfair, the scorer, who'd not been into the changing rooms at all. So yeah.
I've gone right off Ludgrove, I must say. Because there was a thing on QI years ago where Stephen Fry pointed out the I before C except after E, that rule, is completely outdated now. And in the Oxford English Dictionary, it's considered completely wrong to teach it. And there was a kid who came eventually to QI as a member of the audience at Ludgrove who said this in his English class, that I before E except after C, isn't it, is completely wrong now. And he was asked to leave the school. So, yeah.
Standards are maintained, obviously. Yeah.
I don't know if he was beaten as well, but so anyway, you went on to Harrow.
Yeah.
And that didn't go well either, did it?
Well, it went better than the prep school for a while, and then, unfortunately, the vicar or the chaplain was called Spewy Huey, and he was very elderly, and he had to conduct the sermon whilst sitting down. And on Parents' Day, somebody gave me, to my eternal regret, a yellow whoopee cushion, which I placed under his seat in the pulpit. And the terror I experienced watching him walk up there, I can feel now. I so wish I hadn't done it. You know, when you've done something naughty and then you wish you hadn't. And after the second hymn, he went up to all the parents are there and so on. And he had steel clips and tips to his shoes, and up he walked, got up into the pulpit. Now to God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, all might, majesty and dominion and power, both now and forevermore. And he sat down, the most gigantic fart ripped down the chancel and up the nave. And my eyes were fixed on the headmaster, whose head went round 3 times in the same direction. and rather like Oscar Binliner with the Twin Towers, I had further success to come, because when he went to sit down again, he sat down like a broody hen on her eggs, and that let off another 4 farts. So then my poor father had to collect me the following morning.
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
And so anyway, there you are, not at school anymore. And what did you do next?
Well, Dad came to pick me up, and he was absolutely furious. And he arrived at 9 in the morning, which meant leaving Devon at 2 o'clock or something in the morning. And he arrived, and I was at Westacre, anybody who knows Harrow, and he drove round, and I was standing there, and he said, "Put your luggage in the boot." So I put my luggage in the boot. He said, "Now get in the car." So I went to get in the front seat. He said, "Get in the back." So he then never spoke to me. 4 hours we drove, not a word. And we got to Wiltshire and went down into that village Mere. That's when you come off the Salisbury Plain. And there was a restaurant or cafe on the left there, and he swept in, locked the car, and went and had lunch. I can see him now sitting down with his napkin, and I was locked in the car. The old man's having lunch. Then he got in the car, and we got back home, and mothers are wonderful things, aren't they? And Mother was waiting, and she said, "Are you all right, darling?" I said, "Well, no, things have not gone really very well." So anyway, in the evening, he said, "Now, what do you want to do, Sunshine?" And I said, "I'd like to be a jockey." So he said, "Well, in that case, you better be a good one. Mr. Koenig, who was the trainer I'd started with, he's arranged for you to go to Frank Cundall. You're to get on the train on Sunday morning at Newton Abbot with a bike and your belongings. When you get to London, you get to Paddington, you then get a train to Didcot. I was 15, I'd never been in London on my own at all. I was absolutely terrified. And I arrived at Didcot in the pitch dark, and nobody seemed to know where Aston Tyrrell was, which was Mr. Cundall's yard. Eventually somebody told me, and I had to push the bike because you'd got your suitcase. You couldn't ride it and the suitcase. And it was so foggy, I followed the curb round into a housing estate and then found the road again. And I got there about 8 at night. I was terrified. And the stable lads' accommodation was next to the pub. And there were 8 lads there. And in those days, they were every age. There was an apprentice who was 15 or 16. And then there were single men of 45, 50, drinkers, disappointed, bullies. And anyway, I said, my name's Mark Prescott. I've come from Devon. And one of them said, congratulations. That was it, you know. The television flickering in the corner, black and white. So I said, is there a room for me? And they just pointed. I went upstairs, and every room was locked. I got higher and higher and higher and higher. And the very top room was not locked. And that was because the hierarchy there was that you got a better room the longer you stayed. And the top room was icy cold, and it had a triangle window and newspaper tucked into it and sellotape, and the filthiest mattress you've ever seen in your life, and nothing else. I dumped my things on the bed, came downstairs. I'd have given anything to be back at school, anything. And I came downstairs, and I said, is there something to eat? And they said, there's a ham there. Cut a bit of ham off, sat down, and then down the stairs came Gordon, who was about 45, 50, my size, and he's wearing my suit, my clothes, my hat, my shoes, my everything.
What?
Sir Mark fucking Prescott, how do you think I look? Oh, Jesus, how am I going to get out of this? And he said, you're sitting in my seat.
Oh, my God.
So I said, I had a feeling I might be, you know. I sort of got the feeling the way the wind was blowing, it wasn't very good. And I'd been very lucky by now, and I'd been very lucky, and I'd been taught self-defense class when I was bullied at prep school, and by Mr. Green, who I'm eternally grateful to. And amongst the many helpful hints that Mr. Green had given me was that if you clap your hands round somebody's ears, and ladies here should, if you're attacked from the front, all you've got to do is clap your hands round their ears like that, and they fall like a stone, because your middle ear controls your balance, and you can't stand. And I'd never tried it, but Mr. Green had explained it to me. So I gave him his ham, and I went behind him, and I remember praying that he didn't get up, because this could have gone wrong badly. You know? And I got behind him, I went bang like that, and he went, ugh! And there he lay for 2.5 minutes. Fantastic. It worked so well, I can't tell you. I can't tell you. So they took his clothes off him, and I went back upstairs, and I was fine. Nobody liked me, but, you know, I got on fine. Mr. Green saved my life.
That's so wonderful.
And what happened was the children used to come there, and they'd lose all their clothes. They'd take all their clothes. Parents would deliver the child, and they'd be in rags the next day. That was the system. You know. Terrible bullying. It was ghastly, really.
But could you ride, or had you never ridden a horse?
Oh, no, I'd ridden a winner or two.
Oh, had you already?
Which had gone straight to my head, needless to say. Yeah. I rode a winner on my first ride ever, and at Wincanton, and I was 15, and you weren't allowed to ride over fences in those days until you were 17. And the wonderful trainer I started with was called Mr. Koenig, and he had a healthy disrespect for all rules. And he said, now then, boy, he says, you can ride this horse at Wincanton. It's got no chance. He says, you can ride it. So I said, well, I haven't got a license, Governor. Well, he says, all right, we'll get you one. I said, but I'm 15 and you've got to be 17. He says, that's all right. When was you born? So I said, 3/3/48. So he put 3/3/46. And Weatherby's think I'm 77. I've had to lie ever since. And anyway, the thing won. 3-horse race, and it won. And as I came into the winner's enclosure, Mr. Koenig in the immortal lines, as I came in, I couldn't believe it, and he said, "National Velvet, nothing." Yeah, it's a marvellous, marvellous moment. And this thing won, and then I rode another couple of winners. And then, of course, I couldn't be contained at school because the thrill of riding winners.
yeah.
And, you know, I just couldn't go back to being at school. So, hence winding up at Mr. Cundall's.
Yeah, and so had you inherited the baronetcy then?
Yes, not a help when you're in the hostel with 8 other lads. No.
Roughnecks, yeah.
No, people say, has it been a help to your career? It nearly finished it at that stage, yeah.
So how old were you when you inherited? From your uncle, actually?
11 or 12, I suppose, yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So that was 13, maybe, yeah. Uncle Richard, yeah. I never knew him. Yeah.
And what did your dad feel about that? Did he give you a hard time?
My dad was dead, you see, so that's why I got the title. And I'd inherited my stepfather, who was a marvellous chap. Mother married 2 very nice people. I was very lucky. And my stepfather, he absolutely knew how to treat a child like me. And the only time I was rude and took him on, I said to him, "By the way you're talking to me, anybody'd think you're my father." And quick as a flash, he said, "There are very few things in this life I've been spared, but being your father is one of the few that I have." So he quickly sorted me out, yeah.
Okay, so then you're in this awful yard place, and you started being quite a good jockey, apart from
Yeah,
school,
it started to go a bit better. And Mr. Cundall was a great employer. I never really established a relationship with him. I got beat on 1 or 2 that maybe should have won, or he backed, and it never really went very well. And then I broke my back at Y.
I was going to say,
that stopped everything.
So tell people about that. This is an extraordinary story. So what, you're 17?
I was 17, and I was just riding a few winners, and I just got passed for champion by Nick Gaisley. I got injured in May, and it's a great regret that I would have liked to have been champion at something. Anyway, I didn't, and I went to Y, and it was a little sharp left-handed track under National Hunt rules in Kent, rock hard ground, and this thing slipped up, and we brought down 2 more on the flat, and I knew when the horses stood up and galloped off, I knew something absolutely terrible had happened. It's the most extraordinary feeling. It's like being in warm water and treacly water. And I knew that they mustn't move me. And I went to tell them to move me, and I couldn't speak. Wow. And I was seized with this terrible, terrible fear, which never left me. I was seized with fear. And I was totally paralyzed, couldn't blink, couldn't swallow. I had your tongue pegged.
So you couldn't blink?
No, didn't know whether there was anybody in the room. Seized with fear that I could be like that for the rest of my life. And after about 8 weeks, suddenly I could feel people sticking things in my feet. And gradually, everything came back. And there weren't scans in those days, though, you were X-rays. And what had happened is my spine had broken, and the spinal cord ran over it, and it was stretched, but it wasn't snapped. Nowadays, they would be able to tell you that. But, everybody thought I was going to be like that for the rest of my life.
Gosh.
And anyway, gradually, everything came back. And Ashford Cottage Hospital, I can't really recommend if you have a crash on the M11. But then I went to Oswestry Orthopaedic, which was the most fantastic place. And they set about getting you out again. And nearly 18 months later, I walked out. So
18 months.
But it was the most significant moment of my life. And I suppose, really, if 2 favourites get beat at Hamilton, it's a very disappointing day, but it's not. It makes things look a bit different.
That is really interesting. So it's a thing that you can call to mind when...
Every day. Every day.
Wow.
Every single day. It was so awful that every single day I think of it. Yeah.
So my best man, Anthony Pygeri, is a big racing man. He owns a horse called Sheer Rocks at the moment, which is doing well.
Very well.
And like you, he was a little bit older than you. He broke his back in a car crash at the age of 20. And it's made him, it's one of the reasons he was my best man, he's my best friend, is because he has this philosophical view, just like you do, which is you've got to focus on what's important.
Yeah.
Because you could not
it
be
does
here.
put things into perspective.
Yeah.
I don't recommend it.
So, so you're at this. You're a trainer now, and you took over. Was it Jack War's license? You took over?
Ferociously tough man called Jack War. And he...
And again, you're very young at this stage.
Yes, I was 18, 19 when I went there. And he was a legendary, tough, old school man and terrifying until you knew him. In the end, he was a great man. And he became fond of me for some reason. But my first day there, I arrived at 11:15. Well, that's first of all the interview. Imagine an interview like this. I went to Newbury 2:30, 3 o'clock to interview. He saw me, he said, all right. He said, you know, his horse had run rather badly. I waited till it had run. And he said, well, all right. He said, come and have a month's trial. And I said, thank you very much, sir. You know, I'd driven up from Devon to Newbury. I said, when would you like me to start? He said, oh, I'll start tomorrow. I'll see you 11 o'clock. Okay. And off he went. So I drove back to Devon. That was 5-6 hours. I packed up everything, drove up to Newmarket. That was 8 hours with no motorways. And I never saw home again.
Whoa.
I never saw home again. And I was there 2.5 years and I never had a day off. He never said to me, it's Christmas Day, do you fancy going to see your family?
What did your mum think?
She came up to see me.
Oh.
But so it was a ferocious, but he was a great man. And when you got to know him, and my first day there was sort of legendary because we looked round evening stables, and evening stables is rather like, those of you who don't know anything about horses, it's rather like Sir Lancelot Spratt looking round the hospital. Do you remember with Dirk Bogard? And he swept round and said, soon be dead, put her on this, so on. You know. And Mr. Wall went round stables like that. And everything was so clean, you could have eaten your food out of the mangers. The horses were immaculate. The lads then only had 2 horses to look after. Their eyes were Vaseline. I mean, I can't tell you, superb. And I'd only arrived that morning, so the governor said, come in the house. I thought, how nice, I'm so lucky he's going to give me a cup of tea and ask if I'm all right, you know, how lucky can I be? And he said, excuse me, may I borrow that? And he said, now then, boy, he said, have you ever done entries? So I said, yes. I did a bit at Mr. Cundall's. Well, he said, this is the extract I make each week. And there were columns in pencil. He gave me a pencil around. And meeting, date, distance, value, ratings, maximum number, so on. And he said, this is the extract I make, and you'll soon get the hang of my hieroglyphics. That's last week's entry form. This is this week's entry form. Have them on my desk 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, all right?
Blimey.
So I said, thank you very much, sir. So I got nowhere to stay. So I stayed at the pub at the foot of the road. They said, do you want something to eat? I said, I haven't got time to eat. Went upstairs, and eventually he gave me pencil, pen and paper. I could work out all the conditions of the races. I can do one for you now. 3 C&G, MNS, 2 times, ACS. 3-year-old colts and geldings, maidens at starting, not run more than twice at closing. So I had to prepare every possibility, you see. That took me to 11 o'clock. And then it took me from 11 o'clock till about 2 to get it done. And then I made my mistake. It's all in pencil at home. And then I inked in blue biro the horses' names, and in red biro the meetings. Marvellous. Put it on his desk 4 o'clock in the morning. We rode out first lot, he was charming. We rode out second lot, it was charming. We came into my office, which is the same now as it was then, 3 desks. He said, that's your desk, that's my desk, and that's the secretary's. So I sat down at my desk, which was absolutely polished and clean. And to my horror, there was a little pile of shredded paper. And when I looked at it more closely, I could distinctly see blue and red biro. So when the moment came, I said to the governor, I said, was there something you didn't like about the entries, sir? He said, I said, do them in pencil. Put them on my desk tomorrow morning, 4 o'clock. Oh. So that was day 1, which was, you do exactly as I say and we'll get on fine. And once he'd established that, he was the best governor you could ever have. But he was fearsome. Yeah.
Well, you were saying at lunch, I mean, because you're famous in the business for your yard being completely, Annalisa said, not a blade of hay out of place.
Well, we try
Everything's
and keep
polished. The
it
saddles are
nice,
always
yeah.
polished, and you must have learned a lot from Mr. War. And the other thing I was going to say is that you also learned being tough from him, didn't you? So you were quite tough as a young trainer.
Yeah, I was, and bad-tempered and ambitious. And my father was fiery, and Mr. Wall was fiery. And I think because Dad was fiery, I was able to not be
And
terrified.
Mr. Barber was fiery. You had a lot of fiery, didn't you?
Yeah, they
really?
did. And so I was very bad-tempered. But I've got 13 assistant trainers. They always stay with me for 2 years. And I've got 13 assistant trainers that are now training all over the world. And my best team is I've got 3 of the top 10 in France. And the first one who came to me is Pascal Barry. And those of you that follow racing, he's a very skillful trainer. He trains for the Niarchos family and things. And Pascal was with me when I was fiery. And then he sent along Christophe Furlan 20 years later. And Christophe, who's now doing very well and in the top 10, I think he'd been a nuisance when he was with Pascal. And so Pascal sent him my way. So this poor Christophe arrived, and I rang Pascal and I said, now Christophe's here, what am I to do with him? And Pascal, whose English is halting, said, I wish you to be as horrible to him as you were to me. So I said, well, I'm not as horrible as I used to be, Pascal. He said, you must try very hard. Yeah. So it's interesting how they all want you to be as horrible to them. Yeah.
So what do you think is the secret? What have you brought to your career? What's the secret of doing anything well, do you think?
God, what a question. To try and do everything as well as you possibly can every day, and then you can't do more tomorrow. Yeah. So I think that's pretty simple, really. And I suspect that applies to interviewing, to running a business, to doing anything.
Well, I think you're also, despite being fiery in your youth, you're famous for being patient, I think.
I'm patient with horses.
Are you?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that, because as a trainer, I mean, how much is it training the horses? How much is it the jockeys, and how much is the owners? Do you have to train the owners to expect disappointment?
I think training is very much like being a schoolmaster, in that the horses are the pupils, the race course is the exam, the owners are the parents, and you're a very highly paid schoolmaster, and your job is to get the best out of every child that you can. And some of them will be stupid, and some of them will be bright, and some of them will be honest, and some of them won't. But you've got to somehow get the best out of them. And you've got to explain to the parents that their child may not be as multi-talented as they hoped it might be, and deal with it as best you can. And the other thing about trainers is when we start, we have very little qualifications, most of us. But by the time you train for 3 or 4 years, you could ride a home for distressed gentlefolk, that's your owners. You could run a home for maladjusted children, that's your staff. You could run a hospital for the horses you've injured. You're qualified, you could run a hotel. So you've got to be able to do a bit of everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So horses, one of the things you're well known for is, one of your friends said, what's so interesting about Sir Mark is he thinks the way the horse does. What's the horse's point of view?
Yeah,
Would that be true?
Yes, well, I was very lucky to start with a man who I haven't paid the credit I should do, which was Sid Koenig. He was the man who forged my age and so on, and he was a wonderful little horseman in Devon. And he understood animals better than anybody I've ever met since, and that's 50-odd years ago. And he was small and he was cheery, and he'd started in hunt service, and his business model was very clever. He had 8 racehorses, which were normally useless, and then he had 8 horses to break in who had been in other people's stables and they hadn't been able to break them. So he would charge double. So he would only have a horse that someone had failed to break in. So by the time they reached us, you saw absolutely everything. And the great one he had was a horse who came from Ayr, where they tried to break it in. It had then gone to Melton Mowbray, and it then came to us. And its party trick was to throw itself down. As soon as you put a saddle on it, it would just throw itself down. Well, that's very hard to deal with. And when this poor horse came down to us, it had no skin all the way down one side, and the fellow in Melton Mowbray had set fire to it to get it up.
No.
He set fire to the straw. Now, by the time they got to Mr. Koenig, he would find a way round, some way he'd find a way round anything. And this horse was obviously going to be a bit of a challenge. And he used to, when the horses arrived, psychology at its best, he used to put it in a dark box on its own, on peat moss, lovely deep litter. And he wouldn't go near it for 2 days. So it'd be there for 2 days. Nobody'd been in. And then he'd go in and say, don't speak to it. Never before has someone been in and not spoken to it. Automatically, you speak to them. And he'd go in and he'd pick up the droppings and then he'd walk out. And the horse would follow him round. Because it's in the dark, it wants a friend, and the friend just goes and leaves it. And for the first time, it's actually wanting somebody to. And so he'd go in the afternoon, and this time he'd give it a drink of water, and he'd make a fuss of it. Count its ears, Mark. It can't swallow without its ears moving. 17 times will do it. And so gradually he's changed the relationship. The horse now wants to see him. That's number one. And then we took the horse down to the church at the back. There was a marsh, and we used to lunge them. That's when you let them trot round you in a circle and get tired-ish in the heavy ground. And then Mr. Koenig put a saddle on him. And as soon as we put the saddle on him, down he went. And he just lay there. Now then, boy, he says, you will find that he will arise without setting fire to him. And he got hold of his ear, and he got in his pocket a bottle of water, and he poured the water in its ear, and it shook its head and stood up.
Wow.
Now, the other fellow set fire to it. You know, just a genius. So the horse stood up, but the trouble was he then chucked himself down as soon as he'd shaken his ear. So now we were no better off. So the next day, the box had a ladder going up in it. We went up into the loft, Neil, his son, who had a terrible stammer, and me, and we pulled the horse off his front legs so that he's not hurt in any way, but his hind feet are on the ground and his front feet are off the ground. Now, therefore, he can't move. Put the saddle on him, made a fuss of him, and he seemed absolutely fine. We let him down a step at a time. I remember Neil saying, Dad, my arms are killing me. So we let him down a step at a time. And there was a hatch, you know, in the loft. There was a hatch there. And as soon as the horse's feet touched the ground, he was gone. And we were pulled out, bang, hit our heads coming through the loft there. And Mr. Koenig, who was 60-odd, did the first Frisbee flop in history, went straight out over the half door of the stable. And the horse went across the yard, hit the wall, and lay there motionless. So while he was out for the count, we got everything on him. So then he wouldn't get up. The next day, he just lay there. First lot, second lot, third lot, wouldn't get up. And so now what are you going to do? So the governor took all the tack off him. The next day, we took him down to Totnes, the River Dart, those of you down there, and there's a big meadow there. And he said, now take him in the water. So we took him in the water, and there's an old causeway there. We pushed him off the causeway, stood him up there, and then we put the saddle on him. Now, Mr. Koenig had no really vocabulary at all. Where this expression came from, I don't know. But the horse went down, and then he came up and went down, and he said, you will find, Mark, he is peculiarly tenacious of life. And up he came, and down he came, and up he came. And then he legged me up on him, and we took him up onto the bank, and he trotted round the figure of 8. He went back to his owner a fortnight later, absolutely fine. Now, that man is a genius.
Yeah.
And a privilege to be with someone like that.
Oh, fabulous. So,
wouldn't he be thrilled to get a round of applause?
Yeah. One of my other best friends is a guy called Richard Burridge, who owned Desert Orchid, famously, the famous jumper. And so he asked me if I'd like to own a leg of a horse called High Cotton.
Yeah.
And High Cotton, so Desert Orchid won everything. It was an amazing, amazing horse. And Richard was baffled with High Cotton, which was a very good horse, that never won. He went out, I don't know, 50 races, something like that. Came second lots.
Trained by Mr. Ellsworth.
It was, actually. Well, go on.
Well, great trainer, great trainer.
And several other people. Richard tried everybody. But it never won. I went to the winners' enclosure quite a lot, but only because it came second or third. Now, what's that going on there? Do horses want to win races?
Yes, to a degree. The winner always has the easiest race.
Right.
Lots of people forget that because he won because he reached the pain threshold last. So the winner has the easiest race. So we had a horse last week, Glenister, he won 3 races in 6 days. And everybody said, you know, how do you... Well, the reason was that he had the easiest race each day. And he jogged up the next morning, it was bright, off he went and he won again. So most horses have a competitive streak. Most horses see through it at some age where they start to save themselves a bit. And no more than the rest of us when we've done our job for a long time.
Mm.
And your fellow saw through it rather early.
Yeah.
I think the thing is that I always say to people owning a racehorse that, you know, the thing about owning a racehorse, if you own horses any length of time, you will lose money.
Yes, I found that.
You will lose money. Even if your first one is good, if you owe them a long time, you will lose money. The difference is that if you're well advised and lucky, you will lose money more slowly and more pleasurably than if you're badly advised and unlucky. So I think that's...
No, we lost, I can't remember how much, but it won £70,000 in prize money, but never won.
I'm afraid
we lost every, you know.
They can do that.
Yeah. But it's fun. It's
it
great
can
fun
be, yeah.
with a nice trainer.
Can be a
it's great
torture
fun
as well.
Yeah. But your owners are very loyal to you, I think, aren't they?
Yeah, I've been marvellous. I've had to ask 3 to leave and 1 left me, and that's my total in 53 years. So I've been very lucky.
And what are the reasons for asking them to leave?
Well, dear Mrs. Hammond was rude to the jockey.
Oh.
And George Duffield was my jockey. He rode for me for 31 years, and he got in a terrible tangle at Kempton and should have won. And Mrs. Hammond was American and very fiery, and she said, gee, you train them so well, and that dreadful Duffield, I shall have a word with him. I said, Mrs. Hammond, you leave Duffield to me, all right? I shall have my say. I said, Mrs. Hammond. Anyway, poor George got off it, and off she went. And fortunately, so I handed Mrs. Hammond the reins. I said, there you are, you better train him. And Gavin Pritchard-Gordon was walking by, and last I heard was her saying, Gavin, Gavin. And it won him a couple of races, so we all did well with it.
But it's very, because George Duffield won a lot for you, didn't he?
31 years he rode.
How many races did he win?
900 and something. He wrote a very bad book called Gentleman George. And anybody who's read the book always asks me, my hostel in Newmarket for the lads stands on the corner of the heath. And they always ask me, which window did I hang him out of upside down for calling the housekeeper a fucking old cow? And it's that top one over the railings. And I always felt our relationship was built on the fact that he thought I would drop him if I had.
What did Mrs. Hammond think of the book? Was she nice about it?
I don't know. She'd gone back to America by then. Yeah.
Well, we're very amazing. I could talk to this guy forever. Couldn't you listen to him? It's just marvellous. Somebody told me last week, one of your friends, that they thought you'd have made a great prime minister, which I would certainly sign up to. Certainly a lot better than the last, is it 8 prime ministers?
Well, I could have beaten a couple of them, couldn't I?
Yeah.
But, no, I think...
what would you like to have done if you hadn't been a trainer?
Well, I suppose I think I would have liked to have been a criminal barrister. If
that's what I wanted to be at university.
Yeah, because I think people are endlessly interesting. And I think corporate law would have bored me to tears. But I think I would have loved to... I'd have loved to have defended Rose West, who clearly was guilty, but there was actually no proof.
Oh,
do you see what I mean? I'd have loved the task of...
We could be a double act, Sir Mark. My name is Sir Hardress Lloyd, and I appear for the prosecution. May I introduce my colleague, Sir Mark Prescott?
We'd have done well.
We'd good.
We'd have done well.
Yeah. So, and the other thing that Annalisa asked me to ask you, what would be your ideal last meal?
Baked beans. I have baked
On
beans.
toast?
I have baked beans kind of cold out the tin.
You
With
don't?
2 bits of toast, yeah. And every meal I have at Heath House, being a bachelor, takes 11 minutes to eat, to prepare, eat, and wash up.
And
so the whole thing is simplicity itself.
do you have mango chutney with it, though?
And I have mango chutney with any ham or anything like that. Mrs. Baldwin.
Oh, marvellous. Well, we've got a few minutes for questions. Anybody urgently like to ask a question? Would you have a microphone? Oh, there's one over there.
What is your opinion of using performance-enhancing drugs with horses for racing?
Well, it's in England. It's banned within the length of time it could affect their performance, and I think are you from America or where they've got terrible problems at the moment, and that's because if you allow medication to go too far, instead of helping the horse, it enables the horse to be trained when he should be rested. So England has led the way really for a long time on this, and I'm glad to see that America is gradually, state by state, would I be correct, is beginning to follow this, and the horses, it's obviously in the horse's interest to maintain his career, but not at the expense of his long-term future. So for once, England is in the virtuous ring for once. Yeah.
I recall lying on the ground with an army horse half on top of me and thinking, hope I can move my toes. But thank you so much for reminding us of the expertise that was developed in the hunting field, and what you were saying about that wonderful first trainer that you played. It's my old mother to a T. She did almost similar things, almost uncanny.
Dear old Mrs. Mack.
Yes. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Is there a chance, do trainers ever confer with each other about whether they're going to enter a horse? And
she's a naughty girl. There's all sorts of unwritten rules in racing and trainers, and one of the clearest rules is that if another trainer asks you point blank, you've got to tell the truth. So you can kid, but you can't actually lie.
That's a wonderful.
And it's observed very, very much, because sooner or later you'll get done if you don't. And when long time ago, I'd been training about 8-10 years, and there was a young trainer started up, and he was very glitzy and he was doing very well and everything was going his way. And a race came up in the middle of the year at Ayr, in which there was a small entry, only 5 entries. 2 were his, 2 were mine, and another horse of poor Mrs. Stubbs's who was no good. So it's a simple phone call. And I said to the trainer, now, if you run the horse called Caribbean Dream, I won't run. If you run the other horse, I will run one of my 2. Now think carefully before you answer, because one day you'll need me. He said, I'll run Caribbean Dream. I said, that's fine. 3 days later, the race came out. He ran the other one, which won 6 lengths from Mrs. Stubbs. Clever boy, you've had a winner. But I just logged it a bit, and God is good if you wait. And 2, maybe 3 years went by, and our hero is at Musselburgh at the end of the season, Edinburgh. And I've driven up there with Duffield, 6 hours, but our hero has flown up on the plane. And he's got a runner in a later race, but he's miscalculated that because the clocks have changed, he now can't get back on the plane. The only Newmarket trainer there to assist him is me. God, you are too good to me. How do you give me these favours? So he said, will you hang on and wait for me? I said, I will. He said, it means waiting an hour. I said, it'll be a pleasure. I said, I'll be out the main gates. The boot will be open. Chuck your jacket and your bag in and whoosh, because we can't get caught up in the traffic in the middle of town. Well, he said, this is very good of you. I said, no bother at all, you know. So his horse ran. He came running out like a long dog. The boots open, chucked his jacket in with his wallet, chucked his briefcase in, shut the door, got my boots, and I went whoosh. So now he's up there with no money, no jacket, no. And those of you who've been to Edinburgh, there's a little T-junction, and he's running beside me. And he said, Mark, hang on. And I wound the window down. I said, Caribbean Dream, you.
Well, John.
We read a lot about the woes of the British racing industry, and there seem to be a lot of pressures on it. And yet there do seem to be a very strong breed of new young trainers coming through. Is that right?
Yes.
And what do you think the biggest threat to the racing industry is?
The young trainers are very, very good, unfortunately. You know, they're very, very good. And there's a whole host of them that are good. And there was a few years when there weren't so many, you know, and us old-timers managed to keep going. But they make us go a bit now, and they're very good. The greatest danger to horse racing is the same thing, really, is modern people's disconnection with the working animal. They no longer understand the working animal. They understand pets because they have them. They understand wildlife pretty well because they watch David Attenborough. But the relationship of man with the working animal is a mystery to most people now. And they're not interested, whereas previous generations were. As a result, the greatest danger to all animal sports is the misunderstanding of the modern young who have less connection and less understanding. And it is our job, if we want this sport to continue, and it employs 26,000 people in Britain. If we want this to continue, everybody must be educated in the arguments. And I feel that I'm endlessly beating this drum with the poor BHA who run racing, that anybody who is licensed, a jockey, a trainer, a clerk of the course, or whatever, they all have to go on diversity courses, they all have to go on financial, they all have to go on 3 weeks. A trainer has to go on courses now, quite rightly, before he trains. There's not one single hour spent on justifying our sport. And they should be drilled into them so that everybody is competent to make the case for racing. And if we don't do that, we don't deserve to keep going. You know,
That's amazing. Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
So I'm so sorry, Molly, we've run out of time. Mark asked Joanne what she wanted from him today, and she said, well, just be entertaining and interesting for 45 minutes. And I think one of your best friends is Richard Danger.
Yes, great man.
Richard said to me the other day,
Handicapper.
a handicapper, so they work very closely together in all sorts of ways. And he said, whatever Sir Mark does, whatever he says he will do, he does without fail. And that's what he's done this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.